Hi. Tonight in 690L, we're going to discuss some ideas for how to generate ideas for your research project, writing the background, and forming your research question. So, when you approach the research topic, you're generally going to start with something very broad. You're then going to narrow it to focus with your research question. You'll then spend some time working out the design, methods, how you implement your project, how you analyze the data, and then interpret it. And then, again, you're going to focus it on the research report and presentation. Good study design is a balance of experimental design and statistical analysis. You need to have good methods for each of these in order to have a good, sound research project. To generate ideas for your project, you can consider talking to experts or advisors in our program. As I mentioned last week, each of our advisors has expertise in some topic areas that you can approach them about. You can also use the internet or Medscape or PubMed to look up other sources of information, such as that from New England Journal or New York Times. The Institute of Medicine also puts out something called the Pink Sheet, which lists some research priorities. And that is more for drug development and clinical trials, but you might find some interesting ideas there. You could consider looking at professional meeting abstracts. ACCP abstracts we usually post on Blackboard, as well as ASHP abstracts, and you can feel free to ask me if you need links to these, but each of these organizations has websites where they post their annual meeting abstracts. And then consider the NAMCS list of publications that I mentioned last week, and this is on Blackboard as well. And after this presentation, I can show you the link for that. To get started in a specific therapeutic area, you can look at review articles for that area that give you ideas about what information still needs to be researched. Look at similar studies in the area you want to research. So do a PubMed search for that topic area. Make sure you identify a novel approach or change the focus of the research to something that hasn't been done before. Make sure that you're identifying unanswered questions that you can answer in your research, and start making notes from these past studies. The background is essential to forming a good, solid research protocol. The 3 C's for your background is a helpful strategy that was suggested by a former faculty member in our program, Rick Turner. He suggests contemporary, clear, and concise. Make sure your background is of current interest to the medical community. Make sure you cite recent statistics. Make your rationale and goals and methods clear to the reader. And don't write more than is appropriate. Use your skills in scientific communication to focus the reading. It should be more like medical writing rather than a newspaper or a story. Certain hang-ups might be a background that contains incorrect spelling and poor grammar. Substance is critical, and professional presentation is very important. Data are plural. You don't say the data is clear, for example. Data are clear. The word criteria is the singular form, or is the plural form. The singular of that is criterion. And many people confuse assure, ensure, and insure, and be sure that you have the correct version of this word. Those are just some helpful tips for common mistakes. Finally, you should avoid trying to make general comments such as statistics can be misleading. Try to be very clear with your statements and refer to very specifics when making them. In terms of writing and getting started, just get something down on paper first. Try to write your first draft without worrying about it too much. You can leave it for 24 hours, get your red pen out, pretend someone else wrote it, and then revise it. Take out all the superfluous words there and focus your writing. Once you have a good draft, ask someone to read it to see if they can follow your logic, organization, and arguments. Listen to their comments. Try not to get defensive and consider comments, take them personally. People are just trying to help you improve your writing. Use all available tools to ensure an accurate presentation, and aim to finish your work 24 to 48 hours before the deadline. If you're emailing me your background at 4 a.m. when it's due that day, that's a bad sign that you didn't start early enough. Make sure to address the finer criteria, which are a research project that is feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. These are very important elements to consider when you design your research questions and your research project in general. Your title you should be sure that it's descriptive and concise. It does provide the reader a first impression of your study, and it's a lasting reminder of the content and design of your study. You should avoid unnecessary phrases in your title, such as, quote, "a study to determine the," unquote. And make sure your title is concise and not overly wordy. General guidelines for your background and proposal. We want you to have a version date on each version and update that each time. For abbreviations, all abbreviations should be preceded by the full explanation for which the abbreviation stands first, then followed by the abbreviation in parentheses, and thereafter the abbreviation alone can be used. The example are that data will be derived from the National Ambulatory Care Medical Survey, NAMCS database. NAMCS captured data for more than 20,000 AmCare visits for hypertension in 2007. Drug names should be referred to by generic rather than brand names. The first time you mention the generic name, if there's an associated brand name, you can put it in parentheses after the generic name along with the product manufacturer. The example is caspofungin, or Cancitis from Merck & Company, is an echinocandin antifungal agent. Your references should be formatted in using the AMA Manual of Style or similar format as described by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors Uniform Requirements for Manuscripts Submitted to Biomedical Journals. Make sure you use AMA format. I know many of you may be familiar with APA format for social sciences, but in medical writing we use AMA Manual Style. References should be numbered consecutively in superscript numerals as they are cited in the text. References first cited in a table or legend should be numbered so that they'll be in sequence with references cited in the text at the point where the table or figure is first mentioned. When writing your background, you want to explain known information about the research topic or therapeutic area. You're identifying current trends and observations that support your research question. This should contain at least 5 references of other works in the field, if not more. You want to review other studies that have been performed and what they found. How are those studies different than yours? You should address this as well as what questions remain to be answered. If you're using an existing source of data, you should describe how that data was created. For example, what database are you using and what kind of patients were included there and how those data were collected. The background section ensures that the work builds on existing knowledge in the field. This allows identification of factors that other researchers have found to be important. This also assists in selecting the best method for the study. It frames support for your study rationale and gives a list of citations that are used as references for your study. The background will also define key terms, give the reader an understanding of the general nature of your topic and the rationale for doing the study in the particular population that you are studying. It will not provide the detail or the methods used in your study. Those will come elsewhere in your protocol. In addition, the specific objectives and endpoints do not go in your background. We have separate sections for that. For the background, you want to start with the epidemiology of the disease under study. You want to introduce the therapeutic area, give key definitions if applicable. For example, if you're studying diabetes, you would want to say, diabetes mellitus is a disease of the pancreas that leads to insufficient management of or production of glucose or management of glucose. Production of insulin and management of glucose. And then you might want to explain that there's type 1 diabetes as well as type 2 diabetes, etc., and which of those you'll be focusing on. You also want to review the cost of managing the disease or the healthcare impact of that disease, and review other studies in the field with what their unanswered questions were. This is an example of a table produced by a group of students that I've had previously. Their study was focused on predictors of mortality related to bloodstream infections. And rather than have a separate paragraph on each risk factor that might be associated with their outcome, they had a couple paragraphs summarizing some of these risk factors and then made a table referencing the relevant studies that found these risk factors. Their study was going to look at these as well as some additional risk factors, so it was important to mention in their background that there are things that have been associated with the outcome under study. There's an example of this background in Blackboard, and I'll show it to you after this presentation. This is another example of comorbidities associated with their background, including different antimicrobial uses, chronic diseases that the patient might have. When you get to your research question, you want to make sure that your research question reveals the focus of your study, and it is precisely the uncertainty that you want to resolve. Research questions can sometimes be broad, but you really, for the purposes of your protocol, want to make it much more specific. An example broad research question would be, should women take hormones after menopause? This is a very broad question, and probably one too broad for a particular study to answer. So more specifically, you could study, how commonly do women take estrogen after menopause? Or ask, does taking estrogen after menopause lower the likelihood of developing CHD? Or are there other benefits and harms of estrogen treatment? A good research question should pass the so what test. And in assessing the so what, we make sure that it meets the finer criteria, as we previously discussed. Your hypothesis is a version of the research question that provides the basis for testing the statistical significance of the findings. The way you state your hypothesis gives the reader an indication of what statistical method you will actually use to answer that question. For example, to study women who receive estrogen treatment after menopause will have fewer heart attacks than those who do not, the hypothesis statement would state there is no difference in those who received estrogen treatment after menopause, or there is a difference. You should be very familiar with the null and alternative hypotheses based on what you reviewed in Dr. Holland's Advanced Study Design class, but if you have additional questions about this, let me know. So quickly, I'm going to go back to the Blackboard site and show you two good background examples. One is called Background Example A here, and this is from a past student that studied the differences in management of patients presenting to the emergency department with acute ischemic strokes. And for this, she used the NHAMCS. And you can read through this background and see that she has appropriately identified other risk factors that impact her outcomes. She has very nice defined research questions with null and alternative hypotheses for each. There's the second background example that I wanted to show you. This one is quite a bit longer than the first because this group had a lot of risk factors related to their outcome that they were looking at. And this is the one where I mentioned that they had a table of all of the covariates or potential confounders in their study and the previous studies in which they were observed. When starting to write your background, one of the important elements is to think about the annotated bibliography. And in the next video, I'll quickly review the elements of the annotated bibliography and what you need to do for that.